When American General Omar Bradley met Soviet Marshal Ivan Konev in Germany during May 1945, the two commanders exchanged gifts that spoke volumes about their respective military cultures. Bradley presented Konev with a Willys Jeep, a vehicle that had already become legendary among Red Army officers. In return, Konev gave the American general his personal horse, a beautiful Don stallion that had accompanied him since the summer of 1943, when he took command of the steppe front. The exchange was symbolic, almost poetic in its contrast between old and new warfare, between cavalry tradition and mechanized modernity. But for Soviet officers who had spent years fighting across the brutal landscapes of the Eastern Front, there was nothing symbolic about their admiration for the American Jeep. It was deeply practical, born from experience, survival, and the harsh realities of industrial warfare. To understand why Soviet officers developed such profound respect for this American vehicle, you must first understand the desperate situation the Red Army faced in the opening years of the Great Patriotic War. When Operation Barbarossa commenced on June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht smashed through Soviet defenses with a speed and violence that shocked the world. The initial German advance destroyed enormous quantities of Soviet military equipment, including vast numbers of trucks, tractors, and transport vehicles. The Red Army's motor transport situation, already inadequate before the war, quickly became catastrophic. Entire divisions found themselves immobilized, not because they lacked men or weapons, but because they had no means to move supplies, tow artillery, or transport troops rapidly across the vast distances of the Soviet Union. This crisis in mobility threatened to paralyze Soviet military operations at the precise moment when speed and flexibility were matters of life and death. The Soviet automotive industry, while it had made significant strides during the industrialization drives of the 1930s, was simply not equipped to produce vehicles in the quantities needed for modern mechanized warfare. Factories that might have produced trucks were being hastily evacuated eastward ahead of the German advance, relocated beyond the Urals in a massive logistical undertaking that, while ultimately successful, meant months of disrupted production. The Red Army needed vehicles immediately, and it needed them in quantities that Soviet industry could not provide. Enter the Lend-Lease program, that remarkable American initiative that would eventually funnel billions of dollars worth of military equipment to Allied nations. For the Soviet Union, Lend-Lease would prove absolutely vital to sustaining the war effort, though Soviet propaganda would later minimize its importance for political reasons. Among the thousands of items shipped to Soviet ports through dangerous Arctic convoys and overland through Iran, few would prove as universally appreciated by Soviet soldiers as the Willys MB, the vehicle Americans simply called the Jeep. Between 1941 and 1945, the Soviet Union received approximately 52,000 of these vehicles. To put that number in perspective, consider that this represented a significant portion of total Willys production during the war years, and that each one of these Jeeps had to survive a perilous journey just to reach Soviet hands. Some came through Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, braving German submarines and aircraft in the Arctic Ocean. Others arrived through Vladivostok in the Far East, or through the Persian Corridor, that vital supply route through Iran that connected the Persian Gulf to Soviet territory. Each Jeep that arrived represented not just American industrial capacity, but also the complex Allied logistics network that sustained the Soviet war effort. Soviet officers and soldiers encountered the Willys with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism that quickly transformed into genuine admiration. The vehicle's specifications told part of the story. It could accommodate 4 people, though soldiers often packed more aboard when circumstances demanded. On good roads, it could reach speeds up to 105 kilometers per hour, or 65 miles per hour, a remarkable velocity for a military vehicle in that era. But specifications alone do not explain the deep affection Soviet officers developed for this machine. The explanation lies in its design philosophy and how perfectly that philosophy matched the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. Artillery Captain Alexander Rogachev, who served throughout the war, captured the essence of the vehicle's appeal when he described it as mobile, powerful, and low, a vehicle that could be driven straight to the firing line. This was not mere praise. It was a recognition that the Willys had been designed with actual combat conditions in mind, not just parade ground aesthetics or peacetime comfort. The Jeep had no doors, a feature that might seem like a deficiency but was actually a crucial safety element. In the chaos of combat, when vehicles came under fire or needed to be abandoned quickly, those precious seconds saved by not having to open doors could mean the difference between life and death. Soldiers could bail out instantly if necessary. The deep bucket seats provided another example of thoughtful design. They prevented passengers from being thrown from the vehicle when it traversed rough terrain at speed, yet they did not impede rapid exit. The windshield could be folded down flat onto the hood, reducing the vehicle's profile and making it easier to camouflage, a feature that reconnaissance units particularly valued. These squat, low-slung vehicles could disappear into the landscape far more easily than taller trucks, making them ideal for scouting missions behind enemy lines or rapid raids into contested territory. Soviet troops quickly discovered uses for the Willys that went beyond its intended role as a light reconnaissance and command vehicle. Faced with shortages of proper artillery tractors, they began using jeeps to tow light artillery pieces. Gennady Schutz, who served as an anti-aircraft gunner, recalled how their guns were pulled by Willys Jeeps, which proved quite capable of handling the job on level ground. The limitations became apparent on slopes, where the weight of the gun and its loaded ammunition boxes would try to push the lightweight Jeep off the road. It was only in 1944, Schutz remembered, that his unit received heavier American vehicles like the Dodge 3/4 ton and the larger two-axle Chevrolet and Studebaker trucks, which were typically used to tow two guns at once. But in those desperate early years, when proper artillery tractors were in desperately short supply, the Willys served as a lifesaver, enabling Soviet artillery units to maintain mobility even when they lacked purpose-built towing vehicles. The Jeep's reliability under harsh conditions earned it respect across all ranks of the Red Army. Junior lieutenants commanding small reconnaissance units valued it for the same reasons that generals appreciated it for staff transport and battlefield command. It was democratic in its utility, serving equally well whether carrying a colonel to a command conference or transporting scouts on a dangerous mission into no man's land. This versatility was itself a form of excellence in the resource-constrained environment of the Eastern Front, where equipment had to serve multiple purposes and where specialized vehicles were luxuries few units could afford. However, the relationship between Soviet soldiers and their American Jeeps was not without complications. The Willys had been designed for use with high-quality American gasoline, with specific octane ratings and refining standards. Soviet fuel supplies, especially in forward areas and during rapid advances or retreats, often consisted of lower-quality gasoline that did not meet these specifications. Soviet soldiers frequently had no choice but to fill their jeeps with whatever fuel was available, and this substandard gasoline significantly reduced the service life of the engines. Mechanics did what they could to maintain the vehicles, but the cumulative effect of running engines on improper fuel took its toll. Many jeeps that might have lasted years under proper conditions wore out far more quickly, their engines damaged by deposits, improper combustion, and the grinding wear that came from operating outside design parameters. This fuel quality issue highlighted a broader tension in the Lend-Lease program. American equipment was generally designed for American logistics systems, which meant certain assumptions about maintenance, fuel quality, spare parts availability, and operating procedures. Soviet forces had to adapt this equipment to their own very different logistical reality, one shaped by vast distances, harsh climate extremes, limited infrastructure, and the chaos of a war fought across thousands of kilometers of front line. That Soviet soldiers managed to keep these vehicles running despite these challenges speaks to both the fundamental soundness of the Jeep's design and the resourcefulness of Soviet maintenance crews. The cultural impact of the Willys within the Red Army extended beyond its practical utility. In an army that had entered the war with significant numbers of horse-drawn transport, and where many soldiers came from rural backgrounds with limited exposure to automobiles, the Jeep represented a glimpse of American industrial modernity. Soviet officers who had the opportunity to drive or ride in these vehicles could not help but notice the difference in manufacturing quality, the attention to detail, the smooth operation of components. This was not a matter of one system being superior to another in some absolute sense, but rather a recognition that American industry, protected from invasion and bombing, operating with abundant resources and established production techniques, could achieve a level of finish and reliability that Soviet industry, fighting for survival and racing to evacuate factories ahead of German armies, simply could not match during those desperate years. The presence of tens of thousands of American vehicles in Soviet service also had subtle political implications that Soviet leadership had to manage carefully. Stalin's regime had built its legitimacy partly on claims of Soviet industrial prowess and the superiority of the socialist system. The undeniable fact that the Red Army was heavily dependent on American trucks, jeeps, and other vehicles complicated this narrative. Soviet propaganda during the war acknowledged Lend-Lease assistance, but tended to minimize its importance, emphasizing instead Soviet production achievements and the heroism of Soviet soldiers. After the war, as the Cold War deepened, official Soviet histories would downplay Lend-Lease even further, sometimes to the point of barely mentioning it. But the soldiers who had fought the war knew the truth. They had driven the American vehicles, eaten American canned food, worn boots made from American leather, and they understood how vital this assistance had been. When the war ended in May 1945, the question of what to do with all the Lend-Lease equipment became a point of contention between the former allies. The terms of Lend-Lease specified that equipment destroyed or consumed during the war required no payment. But equipment still in existence at war's end was supposed to be either returned or purchased. The United States expected the return of vehicles, aircraft, and other equipment that remained serviceable. The Soviet Union, economically devastated by the war and facing enormous reconstruction challenges, was reluctant to return equipment it desperately needed, and unwilling to pay prices it considered excessive for used military surplus. Most of the Willys Jeeps in Soviet possession were indeed returned to the United States after the war, though the exact numbers and the condition of returned vehicles became matters of dispute. The remaining Jeeps, those that stayed in the Soviet Union through various bureaucratic mechanisms or simple retention, found new lives in the post-war economy. Soviet industry was slowly recovering, factories were being rebuilt, and production was resuming. But consumer goods and civilian vehicles remained in desperately short supply. The country faced the enormous task of reconstruction, of rebuilding thousands of destroyed cities and towns, of restoring agriculture, of repairing infrastructure. In this context, any functional vehicle was precious. The Willys Jeeps that remained in the Soviet Union became prized possessions, particularly for provincial officials and managers of collective farms and local industries. These officials, responsible for overseeing reconstruction efforts in their regions, found the Jeeps ideal for their needs. The vehicles could handle poor rural roads that would have defeated passenger cars designed for paved surfaces. They were reliable, relatively simple to maintain with basic tools and mechanical knowledge, and their versatility made them useful for everything from inspecting construction sites to transporting supplies to remote villages. For a provincial party secretary or collective farm chairman, possession of a Willys Jeep was both a practical asset and a status symbol, a sign of importance and access to scarce resources. This post-war civilian use of the Willys had an unexpected consequence for Soviet automotive design. Soviet engineers and designers, studying the American Jeep and recognizing its utility, began work on creating a Soviet equivalent. This effort would eventually result in the GAZ-69, a light utility vehicle that entered production in 1953. While not a direct copy of the Willys, the GAZ-69 clearly showed the influence of American design philosophy, adapted to Soviet manufacturing capabilities and requirements. The GAZ-69 would go on to become ubiquitous in the Soviet Union and throughout the socialist bloc, serving in military and civilian roles for decades. In this sense, the American Jeep's legacy in the Soviet Union extended far beyond the war years, influencing Soviet automotive development and leaving a lasting mark on the country's transportation landscape. The story of Soviet officers and their American Jeeps illuminates several broader truths about World War II and the alliance that won it. First, it demonstrates the absolutely critical role of industrial production and logistics in modern warfare. The Eastern Front was decided not just by the courage of soldiers or the brilliance of commanders, but by the ability to produce, transport, and maintain the enormous quantities of equipment that mechanized warfare demanded. The Soviet Union's ability to sustain its war effort depended on a combination of its own relocated and expanded industry, the extraordinary sacrifices of its civilian population, and substantial material assistance from its Western allies, particularly the United States. Second, the Jeep story reveals the complexity of the wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western powers. This was never a partnership of equals or of shared ideology. It was a pragmatic alliance born of necessity, joining together nations with profoundly different political systems and long-term interests against a common enemy. The flow of Lend-Lease equipment represented both genuine cooperation and the seeds of future tension. American aid helped ensure Soviet survival and victory, creating a debt that Soviet leadership found politically uncomfortable to acknowledge. The post-war disputes over Lend-Lease settlements and equipment returns were early signs of the deteriorating relationship that would harden into the Cold War. Third, the contrast between the American Jeep and Soviet vehicles of the era highlights the different paths of industrial development in the two countries. American industry in the 1930s and 40s benefited from decades of mass production experience, abundant resources, a large domestic market, and freedom from the disruptions of war on its own territory. Soviet industry, while it had achieved remarkable growth during the industrialization drives, was younger, operating with more limited resources, focused heavily on heavy industry and military production, and then devastated by the German invasion. The quality difference that Soviet soldiers noticed in American equipment was not evidence of inherent superiority of one system over another, but rather the result of different historical circumstances and developmental trajectories. Finally, the story reminds us that history is experienced most directly not through grand strategies or political decisions, but through concrete, tangible things like a reliable vehicle that starts in the morning handles rough terrain, and gets soldiers where they need to go. For the Soviet officers who drove Willys Jeeps across the battlefields of the Eastern Front, from the desperate defensive battles of 1941 and 1942, through the great offensives of 1943 and 1944, to the final victory in Berlin in 1945, these vehicles were not abstractions or symbols. They were tools that worked, machines that could be trusted, equipment that helped them survive and complete their missions. The affection they felt for these American Jeeps was earned through thousands of kilometers of hard use under the most demanding conditions imaginable. When we look back at the Second World War from our vantage point more than 7 decades later, it is easy to reduce it to maps with moving arrows, to statistics of divisions and casualties, to the grand narrative of Allied victory over Axis aggression. But the war was won in countless small moments by individual soldiers and officers making decisions, using equipment, solving problems. The story of why Soviet officers adored the American Jeep is one of those small stories that reveals larger truths about alliance and industry, about design and utility, about the human dimension of mechanized warfare. It reminds us that even in the midst of history's greatest conflicts, people notice and appreciate quality, reliability, and thoughtful design. And it shows us that sometimes the bonds between former allies, however strained they may later become, were forged not just in grand diplomatic conferences, but in the shared experience of soldiers who recognized good equipment when they saw it, regardless of where it came from.